Mid-July 1944. More than a month has passed since the Allies landed in Normandy, and despite their intention to seize Caen during the first hours, the Germans continue to resist south of the city. Whether in the offensives of the first days, in the attempt to outflank by Villers-Bocage, in the Great Epsom operation, or during the Charnwood offensive in which Caen was completely destroyed, Montgomery repeatedly came up against a wall. After once again concentrating a very large number of soldiers and material, and with the prestige of Montgomery himself and British power at stake, an offensive with the largest possible number of units is once again prepared for July 18th. The operation that we are going to see below, which will be 81 years old, is a clear example of the war that shows how an attacking force overwhelmingly superior to the defensive force can fail miserably. In addition, we will analyze in depth how Colonel von Luck intervened, who together with a battery of 88mm cannons annihilated dozens of Allied tanks. Operation Goodwood arose from the Allied High Command's fear of finding itself at a stalemate in the Normandy campaign, which had become something like the trench warfare of World War I. For many weeks, both armies had suffered tens of thousands of casualties without any significant progress, and this was something that had to come to an end. The operation was born then, at a time of maximum frustration on the part of the Allied High Command, which contributed to a great controversy and strong internal debates. One of the main Allied problems was that the beachhead they had obtained was approximately 20% of the planned size, which caused a strong congestion. This had meant that Allied commanders were unable to exploit their advantages in mobility during the months of June and early July 1944. The plan for Operation Goodwood was very simple. Using as many infantry and armored divisions as possible, the aim was to break through the German defenses east of Caen and open a route to Paris. If this offensive was successful, the entire German defense in Normandy would collapse, and a large German troop encirclement would be possible. To this end, the Americans planned their own operation in the vicinity of St. Lo, which would be known as Operation Cobra and would be launched a few days later. If both offensives went well, the Germans would be surrounded. To this end, the Allied forces deployed one of the most powerful ground contingents of the entire campaign. In total, some 1,200 tanks were assembled, plus another 350 supporting the infantry divisions. Added to this were more than 4,500 aircraft and almost 120,000 men. On the other hand, the worn-out German troops had about 220 tanks and several hundred aircraft in support, along with 29,000 infantrymen. All the German divisions were in a very sorry state, and their ability to recover was diminishing. Although the soldiers of the German army had begun the campaign with high morale, fully convinced that this was the decisive battle and that they would expel the Allies from Normandy, by mid-July everyone knew that the end was near and that they would soon be fighting on German soil. However, breaking through the German defenses south of Caen, although in theory it seemed a simple task, in practice turned out to be a much more complicated challenge. The German defenses in this area were organized into 4 defensive belts or zones, which had been established as such on the orders of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The first line was composed of the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division, deployed around Touffeville, Cuverville, and Demouville. Its role was to give early warning, slow down the enemy advance, and disorganize their formations. In doing so, it hoped to gain time for the German rearguard to prepare. The second line of defense, situated further south, was anchored in several strategic villages, with Cagny standing out as a point of strong resistance. Each of these villages had a battery of 6 anti-tank guns and much infantry. Its mission was to slow down Allied advances and, in particular, to attack armored vehicles attempting to cross the open ground between the villages. Beyond these positions was the third and best prepared defensive zone, situated along the rise known as the Bourguebus Ridge. Anchored by the villages of Bourguebus, Hubert Folie, and Braz, this line contained well-protected infantry formations with around 80 artillery pieces, 2.5 brigades of Navalwerfer rocket launchers, and 44 fearsome 88mm FlaK anti-aircraft guns. To the south of this position, out of visual range of the attackers, lay the fourth and final defensive zone. If the British managed to advance to this point, they would face the 60 tanks that the Leibstandarte division had there, half of which were Panthers and half Panzer IV's. In addition, the powerful 503rd Heavy Tank Battalion, equipped with 36 Tigers and some of the newly introduced Tiger II's, was waiting to counterattack. The British had information on the exact number of German forces, and their distribution was at best imprecise, but they were fully confident of their material superiority. The British offensive began on July 18th at 5:30, with the most intense massive bombing raids yet. More than 4,500 RAF and 8th and 9th Air Force aircraft carried out a carpet bombing of 8,000 tons of bombs against the German defenses. To give us an idea of its intensity, it was equivalent to half the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The lack of visibility due to the columns of smoke and dust was so great that some bombers had to abort the mission, while the rest dropped thousands of bombs indiscriminately, even affecting their own troops. In addition, these bombers were joined by 720 artillery guns that dropped 250,000 shells, which finished off the German defensive positions. As if that were not enough, 1,400 Allied aircraft were engaged in air protection and harassment duties at German airfields, so the Luftwaffe could do absolutely nothing against the gigantic display of Allied Air Force. Another objective of this enormous Air Force, which had been mobilized a few days in advance, was to intercept all German movements in the area, and the attack was attributed to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was on the verge of being killed. The main advance at Goodwood was made by the British armored vehicles of the 11th Armored Division, which, grouped together on a 2-kilometer front, had to penetrate the German defenses deep in their rear, southeast of Caen. Paradoxically, this massive bombardment that devastated the German defenders also affected them, as their armored vehicles had great difficulty in overcoming the enormous craters of their bombs. In this initial phase, the British advance was relatively smooth, taking advantage of their enemy's confusion. By 10 a.m., they had already reached the small town of Grentheville. However, as they advanced, German resistance began to stiffen. Some of the German anti-tank batteries, which had managed to survive the bombardment, began to fire. Soon, the sound of the guns was mixed with the roar of the rockets launched by the nearby Navalwerfer batteries. It was clear that the defenders were recovering from the initial shock and preparing to give battle. Little by little, and despite the difficulties they themselves had created, the British armored vehicles relentlessly forced their way through the first German defensive line. The strong resistance that the Allies encountered in the vicinity of Le Mesnil-Fremontal forced them to turn southwest. Thus, the British armored vanguard continued to advance, thinking that they would soon be able to break through the German defensive lines and their enemy's resistance would be over. At this point, all was calm, which offered them some security. However, Grentheville and Soliers were still in German hands, as was the ridge that rose in front of them. It was at this point that the decision was made to send a small reconnaissance force to assess the enemy positions in the vicinity of the village of Hubert Folie. The reconnaissance mission was a complete failure. Although the British were able to reach the vicinity of Hubert Folie, they were unable to locate the German defenders and reported to their superiors that the sector was clear. However, numerous Germans were waiting in that position. The Germans apparently did not want to open fire so as not to give away their position until a larger enemy force approached them. Thinking the all clear, the British armored vanguard began to head towards Hubert Folie. The planned route for the advance would take them between Cagny and Grentheville, advancing to the Bourgebus Ridge. However, their first major obstacle was to bypass Cagny, where they began to encounter enemy resistance. On the other hand, the Germans, somewhat disconcerted after the brutal bombardment they had just received, were trying to regroup. The crucial man in the action we are going to analyze below was Colonel Haas von Luck, who at just 33 years old had participated in practically all the German offensive operations since the beginning of the war. During the Battle of Normandy, he was assigned to the 21st Panzer Division and was notable for being the first to face the British paratroopers on the eastern bank of the Orne River. When the British launched Operation Goodwood, von Luck was on leave in Paris and quickly had to head towards Normandy. As soon as he reached the town of Cagny, which the Allies had bypassed to the west, the German colonel saw between 50 and 60 British armored vehicles heading southwest in front of him. This column of armored vehicles was by no means the enemy vanguard, as dozens of English tanks were further south, heading towards Bourges. As he rushed back to headquarters to report what was happening, von Luck saw an anti-aircraft battery on the outskirts of Cagny firing at Allied aircraft. Remember that at that moment, the sky was full of Allied aircraft that were shooting down any German column that moved in the sector. Without wasting any time, Colonel Luck ordered the battery commander to redirect his fire against the British tanks, which the battery commander refused to do. Faced with this refusal, von Luck decided to adopt a more persuasive method. Thus, he took out his pistol and asked him if he preferred to die on the spot or receive a decoration. The battery commander, despite having orders to fire on enemy aircraft, decided to obey von Luck. Von Luck then ordered the battery to be repositioned at the northwest corner of Cagny and instructed him not to attack the first tanks that were already passing, but to focus on those in the rear. This was done because if the tanks in front were fired on, those behind would see where the fire was coming from and would quickly begin firing on the Germans. Once the German 88 mm guns opened fire, the rear of the British column was devastated, losing at least 12 tanks in a matter of seconds. The leading armored vehicles panicked, and many of them were also destroyed by the Germans. The other British column that had passed through these positions earlier and was now near Bourges was separated from the group that had just been attacked by von Luck. In addition, they soon came under attack from several German anti-tank positions in the vicinity of Solier, Fours, and the Bourges ridge itself. Attacked from the front and flanks by well-camouflaged anti-tank guns in these villages, the British attack group was completely destroyed within a few minutes. This skirmish later became known as the Cauldron. The British armored vehicles could do little or nothing in the face of such an ambush, and the few that survived had no choice but to retreat to the positions their infantry had occupied. The initial assault on Bourges Ridge had failed. However, fighting continued for the next few days, during which the British were able to send more armored units into the sector. The British offensive continued until it stalled on the 21st of July, with the front line between the towns of Cagny and Bourges. During these 3 days, the German armored reserves of the Leibstandarte and Hitlerjugend, which were situated behind the ridge, were sent into battle in a desperate attempt to drive out the Allied defenders. During this battle, the Germans were brutally attacked by Allied aircraft, which in most cases devastated the German units before they reached the fighting zone. The failed Operation Goodwood was a major tactical setback for Montgomery. Despite having a vastly superior force in men, aircraft, artillery, and tanks, British progress was slow and ultimately failed to break through, becoming bogged down again. Despite Montgomery's vast experience, he again made many mistakes, one of the most important being to launch an unusually narrow spearhead, only 2 kilometers wide. This prevented him from taking advantage of his superiority and caused his troops to get bogged down. Finally, when he was interviewed by journalists, he declared that the operation had fulfilled its objective, since it had never been to break the German front, but to distract the Germans from Operation Cobra, which the Americans were going to launch a few days later. This naturally caused indignation among the reporters present. The high losses suffered by the Allies were also harshly criticized, being about 4,800 men and more than 400 tanks. Although many of these tanks were put back into service, the morale of the crews was greatly damaged. In contrast, the Germans suffered much lower tank losses, estimated at around 100. As a curious detail, it is often said that this was Rommel's last battle, since his predictions and deployment orders before the battle were crucial, as well as the performance of the panzer regiments located in the rear. Despite being seriously wounded in the hospital, Rommel had thus won his last battle. In view of this, to what extent do you think that an individual action such as that of von Luck or Michael Wittmann can change the course of a battle?